Lubbock, Texas, yes. Well, we did until we got out of high school finally. We've had a few rough times.
On February 3, 1959, a small plane crashed into a snow-covered field in rural Iowa. There were no survivors. On board were three young musicians, Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper, who were silenced forever. The news spread so quickly that Buddy's wife, Maria Elena, heard it on a television broadcast before anyone had the chance to knock on her door. In shock, she miscarried that very night. Back in Texas, Buddy's mother collapsed, unable to recover after reading the headlines. The tragedy would forever be remembered as the day the music died. But perhaps that phrase alone isn't enough. Because this loss wasn't just about three names. It was the brutal and premature end of a talent that could have shaped the entire decade of the 1960s. The world lost the man who laid the foundation for modern rock and roll, who dared to stand up to a music industry that was controlling artists, who insisted on writing, singing, and producing everything on his own. And that man was only 22 years old, Buddy Holly. The boy with the thick-rimmed glasses, who never stood out for his looks or flashy dance moves, but made the world go silent with a halting guitar riff, a simple melody, and a boundless yearning for freedom. The one Bob Dylan called the brother I never met, the one who inspired Paul McCartney and John Lennon to write their very first song, the one Elton John started wearing glasses to emulate, not because of poor eyesight, but because he wanted to belong to something greater. But behind that legacy, what was left? A short life, a love story that ended in blood, a fractured relationship within his band, a gun kept hidden for decades, and a quiet loneliness that lingered into his final recording. This is the story of a man who once gave voice to the longing of an entire generation, yet never had the chance to fully live his own. And perhaps that's why Buddy Holly's music never truly died. Early life. Buddy Holly was born on September 7, 1936, in Lubbock, Texas, a dusty town tucked between barren fields and conservative Protestant churches. His birth name was Charles Hardin Holly, but his mother affectionately called him Buddy, a name that would later become iconic. The Holly family wasn't well off. His father worked as a tailor, his mother was a homemaker, and they raised 4 children in a tiny wooden house with a modest American dream. Live honestly, believe in God, and raise their kids to be as well-behaved as any proper Southern child. But Buddy wasn't like the rest. He didn't care for sports and wasn't socially smooth. He'd sit for hours by the radio, turning the dial until he could catch stations from Nashville or New Orleans, the kind of music people in Lubbock dismissed as the devil's noise. While other kids swung baseball bats, Buddy clutched a violin he didn't know how to play, so much so that his older brother Larry rubbed oil on the bow just to keep it from making any sound during school talent shows. It was his 2 older brothers, Larry and Travis, who first taught Buddy to play the guitar. But when they were drafted into World War II, they left behind a lonely little brother in an increasingly empty house. As he grew older, Buddy withdrew even more. At school, he was seen as strange, always wearing thick glasses, fidgeting in class, and frustrating teachers with his daydreaming. But his classmates adored him because he was different, cheerful, and could mimic any tune after hearing it just once. At age 11, his mother signed him up for piano lessons. 9 months later, he quit. Not from boredom, but because he wanted to sing and play at the same time, something the piano didn't allow. One day on the school bus, Buddy saw a classmate playing guitar and singing, and it changed him forever. From that moment on, the guitar became his one true companion. He didn't just learn music, he lived in it. The sounds of Hank Williams, Jimmy Rogers, Bill Monroe, Hank Snow, and the Carter family became a language Buddy used to communicate with the world. He began recording early covers in the family living room. One surviving tape from 1949 captures the voice of a 13-year-old boy, innocent, pure, but carrying a sadness that defies explanation. While attending Roscoe Wilson Elementary, Buddy befriended Bob Montgomery. The two started performing at local events, talent shows, and eventually made their way onto KDAV radio, thanks to the support of Dave Stone, who would become Buddy's first manager. But behind the youthful joy was a mind that had matured too early, conflicted and restless. Buddy was fascinated by the supernatural and read dozens of books about mysticism and the afterlife. According to Maria Elena's later recollections, he once visited a fortune teller who warned him that his death would come during a cold, snowy journey. He laughed it off as nonsense, but fate, it seems, did not. Buddy Holly didn't grow up in violence or abject poverty, but in the quiet isolation of a forming genius. No one taught him how to be famous. No one believed that the bespectacled kid obsessing over his guitar in the middle of Texas would amount to anything. But he believed, and the sound of his guitar, urgent, sad, and bold, became the first voice to break through the walls of that loneliness. Early career. Before the world ever knew the name Buddy Holly, young Charles Hardin Holly was already a local star in his hometown of Lubbock. Alongside his school friend Bob Montgomery, Holly began performing at just 13 years old, at school events, church gatherings, weddings, and county fairs, anywhere with a stage and a microphone. The two music-obsessed teenagers were affectionately dubbed the Buddy and Bob Show, playing traditional country tunes with a touch of bluegrass, raw melodies but full of passion. But it was their live broadcasts on KDAV radio that truly launched them. Performing weekly, interacting with listeners, and meeting major artists passing through town, they eventually connected with Dave Stone, who would become Buddy's first mentor. More than just providing recording equipment, Dave gave Buddy a rare opportunity, opening for Elvis Presley in Lubbock in 1955. That show changed everything. Elvis, with his slick hair, provocative moves, and electrifying stage presence, made the crowd erupt, and backstage, Buddy Holly fell silent. There, he saw his future, not in soft country ballads, but in rock and roll. The next day, Buddy ditched the banjo, changed the way he sang, and reinvented himself as part of a rising new sound, rebellious, youthful, and still unnamed. With Dave Stone's help, Holly was introduced to Decca Records and, by 1956, signed his first recording contract. But there was one small and fateful detail. In the paperwork, his surname Holly was misspelled as Holly. From then on, Buddy Holly became his stage name, not by design, but due to a typo. However, Nashville wasn't built for rebels. Decca wanted Holly to return to country music, forbade him from playing guitar on his own recordings, and tried to steer him toward a safer image. His first releases, like Blue Days, Black Nights, and Modern Don Juan, failed to make an impact, not because they were bad, but because they weren't truly him. Within months, the contract was dropped. But instead of breaking down, Buddy Holly went back to Lubbock and started over, this time on his own terms. He gathered his closest musical allies, Jerry Allison, drums, Joe B. Malden, bass, and Nicky Sullivan, rhythm guitar, forming the band The Crickets. More than just a group, the Crickets represented a new blueprint: 2 guitars, 1 bass, and drums, the first modern rock band setup. It was a structure later copied by the Beatles, the Beach Boys, the Byrds, and an entire generation of musicians. No longer under the control of a major label, they recorded and arranged their own music, defying commercial trends. The Crickets became the place where Buddy Holly could fully express himself, crafting a kind of rock and roll that was youthful, technically sharp, and disarmingly sincere. From a small-town boy who had been rejected, Buddy Holly was now ready to change history. With nothing but a Stratocaster, a pair of thick black glasses, and a dream no one else dared to dream for him: career success. By 1957, Buddy Holly was no longer the young man rejected in Nashville. In a small studio in Clovis, New Mexico, far from any major music hub, he created That'll Be the Day, a track marked by its sharp lead guitar, pounding drums, and a youthful yet unmistakably bold voice. No one believed that a DIY recording from an unknown band in the American Southwest could succeed. But when Brunswick Records released the song under the name The Crickets, the entire country was forced to listen. That'll Be the Day topped the Billboard charts in September 1957, instantly turning Buddy Holly and the Crickets into a nationwide phenomenon. They didn't rely on sound effects, dance troupes, or gimmicks. Just the sound of a guitar was enough to make young audiences scream. Because Holly's music brought something truly new: freedom, unpolished honesty, and a closeness that felt like it came from their own voice. In the short span of just 18 months, from 1957 to early 1959, Buddy Holly released a string of iconic hits: Peggy Sue, Oh Boy, Maybe Baby, Rave On, Every Day, Not Fade Away, It's So Easy. Each one carried that unique Buddy essence: light yet rebellious, innocent yet profound, simple yet ahead of its time. He was one of the very few artists of that era who wrote his own songs, sang them, and played lead instruments on the recordings, something that would later become the standard for every rock band. During this peak, Holly delivered a memorable performance on The Ed Sullivan Show, the most coveted stage for any performer of the time. But instead of simply pleasing the television audience, he insisted on playing music his way, which led to a backstage dispute with Ed Sullivan, yet also solidified his identity as an uncompromising artist. Even without the look of a typical idol, thin, nearsighted, curly-haired, always wearing thick glasses, Buddy Holly captured the hearts of millions of teenagers, not just through his music, but because he represented a new kind of artist: intelligent, introspective, and endlessly creative. By 1958, Holly began recording solo tracks under his own name, with songs like It Doesn't Matter Anymore, True Love Ways, and Raining in My Heart. His music evolved into a more refined, orchestral sound, showcasing his depth as a songwriter and remarkable ear, even though he couldn't read sheet music. Once again, Holly refused to stand still, constantly evolving, even at the height of his fame. At just 22 years old, Buddy Holly had already pioneered the modern band format, reshaped songwriting standards, and inspired an entire generation, from the Beatles to Bob Dylan. With over 30 recorded songs in less than 2 years, he became one of the most influential figures of early rock and roll, despite never having a national tour or access to a major studio. Holly's success wasn't measured in numbers, it was felt. It was in how a young man from Lubbock could turn loneliness into melody, disappointment into creative force, and transform rock from a passing trend into a global language. But just as he was beginning to reach his peak, tragedy was already waiting in the shadows. Scandals and inner struggles. Behind the intellectual demeanor, polished style, and youthful music, Buddy Holly was no stranger to conflict, disputes, and heartbreaking choices. Fame came too fast, too young. And like many short-lived legends, his brilliance was accompanied by fractures that gradually came to light. At the height of his success, Holly found himself entangled in one of his most bitter conflicts with the very person who was supposed to be his ally, manager and producer Norman Petty. Petty was accused of embezzling royalties and withholding income from the Crickets' recordings. Tensions peaked when Petty was rumored to have threatened Holly, saying, "You won't see a dime unless you divorce your wife." It was not only a gross insult, but a direct attack on Holly's personal happiness, as he had just married Maria Elena, a Latina working in the music industry. In response, Buddy left the group, severed ties with Petty, and launched a solo career, a risky but necessary move to preserve his integrity. Fractures within the Crickets were inevitable too. Rumors circulated that the hit song Peggy Sue was originally titled Cindy Lou, after Holly's niece, but was renamed after drummer Jerry Allison's girlfriend, Peggy Sue Gerron. This sparked speculation that Holly had personal feelings for Peggy, fueling internal tension. Although never confirmed, the rumor contributed to the rapid dissolution of the band. Buddy's decision to leave the Crickets and go solo in late 1958 stirred controversy. To many fans, it looked like he was abandoning his bandmates just as they were enjoying success. But for Holly, it was the ultimate act of defiance against management control, against band dynamics, and against a music mold he no longer wished to fit into. His tragic death on the morning of February 3, 1959, only deepened the mysteries. Among the most haunting was the discovery of a .22 caliber pistol registered in Buddy's name, found near the crash site. Though there was no evidence it had been fired, its presence sparked conspiracy theories. Was there a struggle on the plane? Was the pilot shot? Did Holly try to defend himself in the chaos? No one knows, and no one has ever proven anything. Even more chilling was the fate of Buddy's iconic glasses, a symbol of his identity, which vanished after the crash. More than 20 years later, they unexpectedly turned up in an Iowa police storage facility, sealed in a plastic bag, never made public. By then, they were no longer just a personal item, but a relic of an unfinished chapter in American music history. And if anyone lived with lifelong guilt over a joke, it was Waylon Jennings. On that fateful night, Jennings, then Holly's bandmate and close friend, gave up his seat on the plane to J.P. the Big Bopper Richardson. When Holly jokingly said, "I hope your bus breaks down in the freezing cold," Jennings replied, "Well, I hope your plane crashes." They laughed, said goodbye. But that line haunted Jennings for the rest of his life. In his memoir, he confessed, "I never truly forgave myself." These incidents, rumors, and shadows didn't make Buddy Holly a villain. On the contrary, they made him human, a young artist torn between ideals and reality, between fame and freedom, between friendship and personal conflict. Part of him always wanted to break the mold, even if the price meant there would be no way back. Personal life. In contrast to his image as a youthful, energetic rock star on stage, Buddy Holly in real life was a reserved, thoughtful man who took love seriously. When the spotlight faded, Holly didn't indulge in partying or recklessness like many of his peers. He dreamed of a family, of stability, a rare luxury for someone caught in the whirlwind of the 1950s music industry. In August 1958, during a visit to a recording studio in New York, Buddy happened to meet Maria Elena Santiago, a Puerto Rican receptionist working at Peer Music Publishing. After just a few hours of conversation, he proposed. Maria thought he was joking, but Buddy was serious. 6 hours after their first meeting, she said yes. Less than 2 months later, they were married in a quiet ceremony at Buddy's home in Lubbock, Texas, far from the press and the murmurs of the music world. Their love was a bond between two lonely souls. Maria had lost her father at a young age and grown up in the cold bustle of New York City, while Buddy, though famous, felt isolated even within the music he created. They quickly became inseparable, as if trying to fill the missing pieces in each other's lives. But career and love rarely move in harmony. Their young marriage was soon caught in tensions that didn't yet have names. Buddy grew increasingly frustrated with his manager, Norman Petty, who was suspected of embezzling royalties and controlling both his finances and artistic direction. Holly decided to leave the Crickets and move to New York, with Maria as his only anchor. But that decision also left him in turmoil, without his band, without infrastructure, and facing financial instability. In January 1959, Buddy agreed to join the Winter Dance Party Tour, a grueling circuit later dubbed the Tour from Hell. At the time, Maria Elena was pregnant with their first child. Buddy had no idea this would be the last time they saw each other. Before departing, he left her with tender words and a simple reminder: take care of yourself and the baby. On February 3, 1959, just hours after hearing the news of the crash, Maria suffered a miscarriage due to the shock. She lost both her husband and their unborn child in the same day. The trauma led her to refuse all interviews for decades and to live in near seclusion. She once said, "Every time I hear his voice on the radio, I feel myself being torn apart, loving him and hurting so much I can't even breathe." After Holly's death, a bitter dispute erupted between Maria and the Holly family in Lubbock. They couldn't accept a Puerto Rican woman having control over their son's musical legacy. Buddy's personal belongings, including music rights, handwritten letters, glasses, and guitars, were scattered, fought over, and even lost for years. It wasn't until the 1980s that Holly's iconic glasses were recovered, mistakenly stored in a police archive in Clear Lake, Iowa. There was no public funeral, no grand memorial, just a quiet farewell at a funeral home in Lubbock. Among those who didn't attend was Waylon Jennings, who had given up his seat on the doomed plane to Big Bopper. He couldn't bear the guilt, especially after his fateful joke to Holly. "I hope your plane crashes." Those words became a nightmare that haunted Jennings for the rest of his life. Buddy Holly died at 22, taking with him half of his wife's heart, an unfinished band, and dreams not yet realized. In an industry built on flash and illusion, he had chosen marriage, stability, and independence. But those very grown-up choices may have taken him out of this world too soon, like a mature soul adrift in the wild fever of rock and roll youth. Legacy and influence. When Buddy Holly died in 1959, many believed it marked the end of a promising young talent, just another teen idol gone too soon. But they were wrong. What Buddy left behind wasn't just a handful of catchy hits, but an entirely new blueprint for modern rock. From band structure to recording methods to an independent spirit in creation. Before Buddy Holly, the music industry was dominated by big record labels, where artists sang only what they were given. But Buddy, in his early 20s, wrote, arranged, produced, and performed his own songs. He formed the Crickets, not as a backing band, but as a unified musical entity. The four-piece band format, 2 guitars, 1 bass, 1 drum, that he pioneered became the standard, later adopted by the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Byrds, and hundreds of other bands. Paul McCartney once said, "If it wasn't for Buddy Holly, there would be no Beatles." It was after hearing "That'll Be the Day" and Peggy Sue that John Lennon and Paul McCartney first believed they, too, could write songs. The name, The Beatles, was even inspired by the crickets, insects that sing in the night. Bob Dylan, at 17, stood in the crowd at Holly's final concert in Duluth. He recalled, "I don't know why, but I felt like he was looking right at me." Throughout his career, Dylan kept Buddy's image as a symbol of freedom and creativity, 2 forces that defined his entire life's work. Elton John has worn glasses all his life just to look like Buddy. Eric Clapton learned to play guitar by practicing Holly's solos. Bruce Springsteen, performing in Clear Lake in 1975, said tearfully, "I came here to pay a debt to the first person who made me believe music could change everything." Buddy Holly's influence reached beyond music and into American culture itself. The phrase, "the day the music died," coined in Don McLean's 1971 song American Pie, became an eternal symbol of collective loss in the American psyche. It wasn't just Buddy Holly who died that night, but the innocence of an entire generation fading away with that plane crash in the winter dark. Though his professional career lasted less than 3 years, Buddy left behind over 50 officially recorded tracks, with timeless songs like Every Day, Not Fade Away, Maybe Baby, and It's So Easy. His final recording, Learning the Game, a simple, melancholic ballad, was completed just days before his death, like a quiet and haunting farewell. After his passing, Holly's music rights became the subject of long legal disputes between his wife and family. His iconic glasses were missing for over 20 years before being discovered in an Iowa police evidence locker. Artifacts like his Fender Stratocaster, songwriting notebook, and even the original contract where Holly was misspelled as Holly, are now treasured relics displayed in museums in Lubbock and New York. In 1986, Buddy Holly was posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. and in 2004, Rolling Stone ranked him number 13 on its list of the 100 greatest artists of all time. Streets, theaters, and schools, from Texas to the UK, now bear his name. Even an asteroid has been named Buddy Holly in his honor. But perhaps Holly's greatest legacy isn't in statues or rankings. It lives on every time a kid picks up a guitar, writes their first song in a bedroom, and believes they just might change the world. In that moment, Buddy Holly is still alive. There are people who never grow old in the eyes of the world, not because they lack maturity, but because time never gave them the chance to age. Buddy Holly was one of them. He didn't have the time to change his style according to trends, didn't get the chance to repeat himself just to stay relevant, and didn't even have the chance to fail and learn how to rise again. But perhaps that's exactly why he never faded. He never transformed into someone else. He never got caught in fads, controversies, or doubt. He remains forever as he was in that first moment, original, simple, and most true to himself. And maybe that's why his music, brief but quietly profound, has never become outdated. Some talents are not born to dominate, but to ignite. They open doors that others walk through and later claim the glory. But it is the name that quietly fades behind the curtain who laid the first brick. With Buddy, it didn't take hundreds of songs or decades of work, just a few minutes of music, enough to make the whole world shift direction. We often mourn what is left unfinished, but it's exactly those incomplete things that tend to stay with us the longest. If you've ever felt like someone living between two worlds, between what you long to do and what no one seems to understand, then maybe you'll see yourself somewhere in the voice of a young man who never had the chance to grow old. What do you think about people like that? Those who disappear just as the world starts to listen. Leave a comment below, share your thoughts, memories, or even just one line for this artist. Don't forget to hit like if you appreciate this brief but meaningful journey. Subscribe to Rock Discovery so you won't miss the other unfinished stories, where music and fate always walk side by side. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video. Goodbye.